Asked by Senator Rhiannon, myself, Senator Farrell first. And
So
your good self,
who are we
I
going to
assume,
next?
Senator Rhiannon.
Where you go.
Thank you, Chair. I was wanted to inquire about the Australian Animal Welfare Strategy Advisory Committee, which I understand was appointed in 2011, but is going to be wound up. How much money in savings does the abolishing of AUSWAC represent?
Thanks, Senator. AUSWAC, the Australian Animal Welfare Advisory Committee, the government announced its abolition, I think in October. I'm just looking for the date, but I think the amount of money that we're expecting to be saved is of the order of $96,000 a year.
And would you describe that committee as having been providing independent and an expert source of advice to the Minister?
The Australian Animal Welfare Advisory Committee has, and its predecessor, the AWS, Australian Animal Welfare Strategy Advisory Committee, have been in existence since 2005, and they have provided advice from time to time on the expenditure of funds under the Australian Animal Welfare Strategy, and indeed were influential in designing and developing and carrying on the Australian Animal Welfare Strategy.
Sorry, carry on.
The Australian Animal Welfare Strategy.
Right, thank you. And so has there been a cost-benefit analysis to properly inform the decision to disband in this body?
No.
Why wasn't that undertaken?
The government, the decision to abolish AUSWAC was announced at the same time as a further other 20 non-statutory bodies. Government was elected with a commitment to reduce red tape, and it was decided to abolish a range of bodies that didn't necessarily had either served their purpose or had didn't necessarily weren't consistent with the new government's priorities. So it's a red tape reduction measure.
Was Biosecurity Animal consulted or asked for any information to inform the decision?
No.
And could you outline what services, types of advice have been lost now AUSWAC no longer exists?
The department has been asked to provide the services, the advice to the Minister in relation to those things. So the sort of advice that AUSWAC was providing was in relation to grants and the future direction of Australian Animal Welfare Strategy, and the government has now asked the department to provide those services.
So considering, from what I understand, AUSWAC did play a key role in maintaining animal welfare standards or being a voice for that, and then I understand, if I'm wrong, please correct me, that the Inspector General for Live Export and Animal Welfare has been removed.
Senator Rhiannon, I should just clarify the first part of your question there. The Australian Animal Welfare Advisory Committee did not have a role in relation to the setting of standards in this area. The Australian Animal Welfare Advisory Committee provided advice to the Minister on the expenditure of funds under the Australian Animal Welfare Strategy. The setting of standards, etc., is a matter for the Standing Committee on Primary Industries and indeed for individual jurisdictions. Most of the regulatory responsibility, as you know, for animal welfare rests with the state and territory governments.
So you would argue that a voice for animal welfare standards was not lost when AUSWAC went?
No, I'd argue that the responsibility for Australian animal welfare standards rests with the states and territories, and that will continue on through the processes of the Standing Committee, the Standing Council on Primary Industries, the Ministerial Council of Primary Industry Ministers.
So just going on to some of the specific work of AUSWAC, that I understand a number of project grants that they were considering have been suspended. Could you update us on what happened to the work at the point at which they were disbanded?
Yes, Senator, the Australian Animal Welfare Advisory Committee on an annual basis would provide advice to the Minister for agriculture in relation to how some of those grant money should be spent, and that was in the process of being provided to the minister when the election was called. So they're paused at this stage, and we're now in the process where the government is considering its expenditure priorities, and so they remain paused. We still have them. The committee's provided the advice on that. If the government decides to go ahead with those grants, then we could proceed. Otherwise, we'll continue on when we get the advice from government.
So paused is understandable when you have these changes, but it obviously brings a large element of uncertainty. So how long are they paused for? What's the timeline for when a decision will be made? A decision just in terms of what's going to happen, so people aren't left hanging?
I really can't answer that, Senator. That's really a broader question in terms of of the government's budget setting process, and all I can really say is we're working through that, and we've tried to make it clear to the people that have put forward those grants, and indeed to the former committee members that this is an issue that needs to be resolved, but I can't give you a timeline.
So when you say a budget setting process, could you identify who makes a decision, please?
This is a decision of the government about whether or not it wants to continue the spending programs of the former government.
So a
It's
ministerial
decision.
Right, thank you. And just one final question before I leave about AUSWAC. Is there any trade implications in the abandonment of these or pausing of these projects?
I don't think so, Senator. The majority of the projects relate to domestic animal welfare issues and the work of the subcommittees that existed under AUSWAC. There may well be, but I'd have to just take that one on notice. But the vast majority of the projects are domestic.
Thanks. Oh, thank you on that one. I was interested in about where the model codes are up to. I did have specific questions with regard to timelines and the actual commitments with regard to those codes. If they requiring detailed answers, which I was hoping for, could you take them on notice, or if it's not happening, maybe it's a quick answer? So I just wanted to explore that.
Senator, the work on the codes, transforming the model codes of practice into standards and guidelines, which is a shared responsibility with the states and territories, that's continuing. That work is underway. There's a number of codes of practice that are going through that process. There's a number of regulatory impact statements out there, so we could provide you that information. I think, in terms of where we're currently up to. It's probably quicker for us to take it on notice in a way, but it's up to you.
Okay, well, I will ask you just about the domestic poultry one, but if you could take it on notice where the development of the model code is up to, when it actually moves over to the standards, and I'm interested in that in terms of the timeline, the staffing, the funding, the resources that are provided. So if you could take that on notice, it would be appreciated. But could we just have some details about the model code for domestic poultry, where it's up to, and maybe we start with the timeline process?
Yeah, essentially where we're up to with the poultry standards and guidelines, it's in its early scoping stages. There's an Animal Welfare Committee, which is a committee of officials that sits underneath the Standing Council on Primary Industries that has been scoping that out in consultation with state and territory governments and with the industry. And so we're at that early stage, and a target date for their completion has yet to be fixed.
Yet to be fixed?
Yes.
And while we're talking about poultry, I mean, ducks and geese and chickens are pretty different animals. So are you really getting down to that level of detail and looking at their different needs?
I might ask Ms South if she has any more information than I've got in relation to that.
The scoping study is considering the different species and the different issues that arise with those species to inform what will constitute a review of the existing model code.
When will submissions be called for, please?
As Mr Glyde said, we're in the early stages of scoping, so that includes determining what will be in and out of scope, what the timelines will be, what the costs will be, and how the stakeholder engagement will progress. So we have further discussions to have within the Animal Welfare Committee before we're able to provide that information on how we will engage stakeholders.
So do we take from that that there's a possibility that you won't call for submissions?
Not
Is
at
that-
all, no.
So there definitely will be a
There
call.
will be. It will follow the normal route for a standards and guidelines development process. If we use the existing model that, for example, has been used for cattle and sheep, that includes both writing and reference groups. It includes a regulation impact statement process. So there is a set methodology to undertake these reviews.
Right, thank you. Mr Deputy Chair.
Here in spirit.
Yeah. Mr Deputy Chair, I did have questions about live animal exports. I just was checking that I'm asking them in this section or
Here.
here.
So you're on a roll, Senator Rhiannon.
So I keep going. So under live exports, what regulatory action did the Department of Agriculture take in the period between June and October this year in response to a complaint lodged in June 2013 which showed Australian sheep being sold from 26 locations, all outside of the SCAS approved supply chain?
Senator Rhiannon, Rebecca Irwin, First Assistant Secretary, Live Animal Export Division. Just to confirm, your question is in relation to exports in relation to Jordan?
Yes.
Yep. So, Senator, the department received a complaint on the 1st of June 2013 in relation to Jordan, which is currently under investigation. The department received a second complaint on the in October 2013, which is also under investigation.
Was that in Jordan as well?
Yes, Senator, yep.
So both separate issues?
Yes. Both of these complaints have come from an NGO, Animals Australia. So the NGO has put some information into the public domain about those complaints. They essentially relate to control of the supply chain and essentially sheep being sold out of an approved supply chain. So, Senator, the key issue is that as the regulator, those investigations are ongoing. As with any regulator, we can take action in relation to exporters and in terms of the sorts of conditions that exporters are required to meet in relation to particular consignments. And for exporters of sheep to Jordan at the moment, the regulator requires a range of conditions that exporters need to meet. They include additional supply chain officers in country locations, additional reporting on reconciliation back to the regulator, and following the most recent complaint, they include that exporters have to have a specific exporters identification marking on sheep that are exported.
So going back to the actual incident, so it happens in June, happens in October. We only know about it because Animals Australia report it to you. And we have Australian sheep being sold from 26 locations, excuse me, all outside of the SCAS approved supply chain. So I just want to ask the question again, what regulatory action did the department take in this period?
So, Senator, the specifics of that incident are under investigation at the moment.
And have you requested documents from the exporter?
Well, Senator, the details of how the regulator conducts investigations are really not matters that any regulator would go into in the public domain. Clearly, under the Act, the regulator has power to request documents from the exporter, to require information to be provided. The Act also gives the regulator coercive powers to issue search warrants. So there are a whole range of powers that the regulator of live animal exports has, as indeed lots of regulators have, that regulators would exercise if they're investigating a particular issue.
We'd have no power at all, though, to do anything about the bribery system up there. I mean, this is don't ask, don't tell stuff. I mean, it's a nightmare, the bribery system.
I don't think we're in a position to answer that as a question.
No, don't, please don't.
And the other point I would also make to Senator Rhiannon is that the premise of a question is these are allegations that have to be established and have to be established properly, and so that's why we've commenced an investigation.
No, so I appreciate that. That's
Can
what
I
I'm...
just hold you there just for a second?
Sorry,
Senator Stells wants a clarification.
I don't normally interrupt. Are you able to tell us, Mr. Irwin, is it the same exporter in relation to these two instances, or is it different exporters?
It's the same exporter, Senator.
Okay, well, I'll come back.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Rhiannon.
So, trying to understand that it's reported in June, and then the same exporters involved in October, and it appears that the allegation appears to be more extensive. So, did you commence examining these allegations in June? And were you satisfied that the problem had been redressed by the exporter prior to the lodging of the October complaint?
Senator, there are two investigations that the regulator has underway, one in relation to the June complaint and one in relation to the October complaint. And there are various issues under consideration by the regulator in relation to both incidents.
So, considering that you had to, I understand, agree to Livestock Shipping Services, the company involved, to continue to undertake this October shipment, I'm trying to understand what decisions that you've made, because you've already had this serious allegation that's hanging over LSS. So how does that work when you have a company that's got allegations against it and you're being asked to allow it to go into the same jurisdiction where these allegations have been made or made?
So, Senator, to explain the regulatory framework, for an exporter to meet the criteria to export livestock, there are two key things that the exporter has to do. First of all, the exporter has to have a licence to be a registered exporter. Secondly, the exporter has to seek approval from the regulator on a consignment by consignment basis for the export of a particular consignment. Simply because the regulator may be investigating a particular incident, it does not preclude the exporter from making individual applications for consignments to be exported. The regulator is required to consider each export according to the regulatory framework, and it's open to the regulator to put additional conditions on any consignment that is exported. And that has been the case in relation to these exports to Jordan.
So were additional conditions put on the LSS for their shipment in October?
Yes, Senator.
What were they, please?
So, Senator, as I said at the outset, the sorts of additional conditions include that the exporter has to provide additional security across the supply chain, that they have to include, say, a supply chain officer to provide additional reporting and reconciliation of the movement of sheep through the supply chain, and those sorts of, they're the sorts of additional conditions that have been applied by the regulator for the export of sheep to Jordan.
So considering that you put in place these additional conditions after the June allegations, that suggests that you are accepting, recognising that there has been some breaches, that there was problems with how LSS was operating in June, because you wouldn't have put the conditions on otherwise.
Well, Senator, as I said, there are two key actions that the regulator has on foot at the moment. The first are the investigations in relation to the particular incidents, and those investigations are ongoing. Whilst those investigations are ongoing, It remains open to exporters to put in applications for export and for the regulator to consider those individual applications. As the regulator, we're not in a position to preempt what the outcomes might be of a particular investigation or what particular penalties or sanctions the regulator might apply as a result of a particular investigation.
Could I just, by way of procedural notice, say, Senator, your time is up. This will be your last question. We may come back to you, but you've had 20 minutes or whatever it is.
So you said I can have one more question?
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Chair. How many investigators are there in the Investigations and Enforcement Unit dedicated to investigating breaches of SCAS?
There are 21 investigators in the department. What work they do depends on what's coming through. They're not limited to one subject area. The investigators provide assistance in quarantine, in live animal exports and illegal logging.
So they're based in Canberra, those 21?
No, they're based all around Australia,
All about around Australia.
including in Canberra.
What about the formal legal investigation? Are they people tasked with formal legal investigation?
The area that does investigations in the department does investigations that may lead to prosecutions.
How many of those people are there, please?
Well, that's the 21 investigators.
So they're the formal legal investigators.
It's an area called Enforcement and Investigations located in the Border Compliance Division, and on behalf of the department conducts work for quarantine, live animal exports and illegal logging.
Could you take it on notice and tell us where they are located, please?
I certainly can.
Supplementary 5. You've done well.
Thank
You've
you.
had
Thank
5
you.
supplementaries.
Thank you, Chair.
Senator Farrell.
Mr.
Sorry,
Chair.
Chair,
I was
Mr.
just
Dwyer.
wondering if I could perhaps clarify a point before we move away from Senator Annan's question. Just to be clear, I think Senator Annan was asking a question in relation to the extent of consultation we had before the abolition of this Australian Animal Welfare Advisory Committee. I think my answer was, I have to check the record, that the members of the Australian Animal Welfare Advisory Committee weren't consulted in relation to the decision, but certainly the Department of Agriculture was consulted in relation to the decision to abolish the committee.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Glyde. Thank you,
Apologies
Chair.
if I misled.
Young man, it's your